Welcome to the Natasha Helfer Podcast. To help keep this podcast going, please consider donating at natashahelfer.com and share this episode. To watch the video of this podcast, you can subscribe to Natasha's channel on YouTube and follow her professional Facebook page at Natasha Helfer, LCMFT, CST-S. You can find all her cool resources at natashahelfer.com. The intro and outro music for these episodes are by Otter Creek. Hello, everybody. This is Natasha Helfer. I'm a relational and sex therapist, and this is my podcast where we try to attack shame and get healthier through education, stories, relationships. Today, it's film. So I've got Brent Bokovoy with me today. He has recently released a short film called Ronald's Little Factory, which is kind of a commentary on the church's the belief that masturbation is a sin. I think he is in particular talking about the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, which is the faith you grew up in, correct? But by no means is the Mormon community the only religious tradition that has seen masturbation as problematic or sinful or evil. It's commonly referred to as the sin of Onan, which is also referred to in the film, which is a biblical story that we can talk about maybe in a little bit. Brent is an award-winning filmmaker, and he is, like I said, grew up kind of in the Mormon community, and I'm super excited to talk to him about kind of what he's been thinking about with this film, what his hopes are for the film, what's been his experience so far with people's reactions, etc. So welcome to the show, Brent.
Thank you. Thank you so much for having me and for hosting the event next week.
Yeah. That's right. That's right. We want to say that right off the bat. So if you're here in the Salt Lake City area, we have next Thursday night, August 3rd, will be at 7 p.m. We will have a showing of the film. I'll be hosting that, and Brent will be there taking questions. And so, yeah, come join us. That'll be a fun evening for sure. Do you want to say where that is? I forget now exactly.
Yeah, that's at Brewvies Cinema Pub in Salt Lake City. And it's the film, it's a feature film, a 90-minute feature. And so we'll get there. So for about an hour before the film, we'll have a pre-mixer, and then the screening will go on about 7:15. And then after the film, we'll have a question and answer session.
Perfect. So really we want to get there around 6:30, 6:15 is what you're saying, right?
Yeah.
Get there early, and that way
if you want to mingle, get some drinks, there's...
Oh, that'd be so much fun. That'll be great. So yeah, make sure you put that on your calendar if you're in the area. All right, Brent, well, let's start off kind of just with having you share a little bit about yourself. Where do you come from? What's your story? Why is this, how are you a filmmaker? How are you Mormon? Kind of all the things.
Yeah. So I was raised in the LDS church, and I was the perfect Mormon boy. I went on a mission, and just about a year after my mission, I just started to have some questions, and that led me to about a year of my life of just reading, praying, and just doing some deep soul searching. And then I ended up just leaving the faith. It's been about 20 years now. Okay. And I really think that the thing that kind of started I started to kind of question some of the things about the LDS religion. I was actually on my mission. I wasn't questioning at the time, but one of my former one of the companion left a anti Mormon book. So it was written by a Mormon apologist, and it talked about all the anti-Mormon things, and they were just defending them. And that was the first time I ever read about all the controversial things. And of course, the Mormon apologist he made, he was defending, making excuses for each one of these anti-Mormon theories. And so, but that's the first time I ever started to do kind of a deep dive into the controversial aspects of the church. And then, but of course I put that away in my mind. And then about a year after my mission, I was never a fan. I always felt weird in the temple, but I still would go because it was the thing to do. And I just remember one time I was in the temple, I was in the celestial room, and I was looking at everyone, and just for some reason, I just had this thought pop into my mind that I felt closer and more at peace with God being out in the mountains than being in this, this $80 million temple, man-based temple. And so that led me on a year journey of just reading all about all other religions, Mormonism, and I just came to the conclusion that I just was not the same church that I grew up with. That I just don't believe in it in that way. So yeah, so that was 20 years ago, and about 10 years ago, I started making short films, and I've always been wanting to make a feature film, and I came up with the idea of Ronald's Little Factory just about 3 years ago, and it's based on my life, and so that's kind of where I'm at my life right now.
Okay. All right. Awesome. So, yeah, so you went through a faith transition earlier than maybe a lot of people. And were you the only one in your family system at the time, or?
Yeah, I didn't know one other person, so I didn't have any other friends, anyone to look up to. There's like I didn't have any other podcasts. So yeah, that's 20 years ago, and so I felt super alone at the time. I'm super jealous of the people that leave now. There's such a great community, so many cool podcasts to listen to. But luckily, my three best friends and my two brothers have now left the church since. So it's that's great, and I have a great support now.
Less lonely. Yeah, right. And when we come from these kind of conservative or high demand religions, however we want to describe them, yeah, usually the community doesn't celebrate that, doesn't find that, they're highly concerned, they're worried about you or actually kind of shunning you in some ways, right? So I'm guessing that's a pretty lonely journey, like you're saying, especially 20 years ago when there wasn't as much conversation or resources for people going through faith transitions. Yeah.
Yeah.
For sure.
Yeah. When was your faith transition?
Oh, that's a good question. I say my faith transition has been trickling for like 20 years.
Yeah. Yeah.
But I was excommunicated from the church a few years ago just due to a lot of my advocacy statements around sexual health and things like that. So,
And you were an active believer at that time. You were an active attending at that time?
I was not active. I had stopped my own activity several years prior because of something that had happened to one of my kids. In the church, they were released from one of their kind of volunteer positions that we call a calling due to their involvement with the Gay Straight Alliance at their high school, and also some of their beliefs around female ordination. Even though they weren't really saying those things in church, the fact that they had written about some of those things in social media or whatever got them disqualified per se of being a leader in the youth. And so that put us in a really precarious position of, do we take our kids to a church that's gonna limit their ideas and their own personal identities, or are we going to continue and force them to kind of go to a church where at this point it had become unhealthy for this particular kid of ours? So we stopped our activity at that point, but that doesn't necessarily mean that my beliefs were not still valuable to me, or my spiritual experiences. So yeah, it was a long kind of journey for me. So not that this interview is about me, but that, I think that's to your point. For some people, a faith transition can be very quick, within a few weeks or months. For others, it's kind of these kind of decade-long processes of kind of shifting from more orthodox to maybe more progressive beliefs, but still wanting to be a part of the community. It's just so interesting how everybody has their own journey. But thank you for sharing about yours. So yeah, so for those of, not everybody who listens comes from an LDS background. And so can you share a little bit about what the Little Factory is referring to, and kind of this talk by one of our leaders, Boyd K. Packer?
Yeah. Boyd K. Packer, an LDS apostle, gave a talk in 1976, and he gave this to the young men. It's an anti-masturbation talk. It's about a 15-minute speech that you can actually still listen to the whole thing on YouTube. But what's interesting about that is the church, so it was part of General Conference, and they took it off their website just about a few years ago, and I hear that that's the only talk that they've ever taken off on their website, supposedly. So very controversial talk that I've known about since when I was a teen in the 90s, and it was always a funny, it's really ridiculous talk. He talks, the whole gist of the talk is that he likens reproductive system to a little factory, and so he says if you touch that little factory yourself, then you'll speed up that little factory, and then it will overwork, and so it just goes on, and it's ridiculous, all these euphemisms for masturbation, and it's a really, most of it is a funny talk, and so I've always known about that. Unfortunately, you listen to like the first like 12 minutes of it, it's really funny and silly, that we can easily laugh off, but the last few minutes he starts to talk about how masturbation can lead you to become gay, and then he spends a couple of minutes talking. It's just a very homophobic, disturbing, almost promoting violence towards or accepting violence towards the gay community. So that's a gut punch when you hear that part.
They actually do say, and you referred to this in the film, that if you are approached by a homosexual person, that you have the right to defend yourself through violence, through hitting them or doing something to protect yourself. So I remember those kinds of things being said at church quite a bit while I was growing up in it. I don't know if you remember things like that, or even conversations with other young men or older men.
Oh, totally. And so that is actually, that whole theme and that kind of the whole gut punch is actually that's really inspired me for the whole take of this movie, is that a lot of it is silly and we can laugh at, but I want, especially the end, I want there to be some gut punches that were just like, oh, this is serious stuff that is really very disturbing stuff that it's just hard to even think about. So but that, I think it's I just that gut punch it's so hard to take, but I think it's necessary to learn about, and hopefully to try to hopefully to have them still change, and because their position is certainly lessened in that way, but there's still a lot of disturbing things that they teach.
Yeah. Well, so do you remember this talk? Like, was this a talk that was, either taught while you were growing up in Young Men's? I remember it was turned into a pamphlet. So I
Yeah.
remember even as a young woman seeing the For Men Only pamphlet in the foyer, in the congregation in the church building. And I remember picking it up and being curious and wanting to see what the heck they were saying for young men only. So, but how much of an influence did this talk have in your kind of growing up years in the church?
Yeah, I remember the talk in the pamphlet growing up, and yeah, but also just the whole topic of masturbation. I was always kind of taught, well, we were all taught that, the sex outside of marriage is that's the second worst sin. That's the worst sin outside of murder. And so I was always taught and believed that masturbation is basically just one step below sex outside of marriage. So in my mind, I always thought that masturbation is literally 2 steps below murder. So, and so
Yeah.
that was always in my mind. And so I was actually, so I was the perfect Mormon boy. So I never partook of that while I was an active Mormon. So, because I felt so strongly, but that's the reason why it was ingrained in me so much. And that inspired me to a few years ago start writing that.
Yeah, wow. Yeah, that's not necessarily typical. I mean, the more typical story is that adolescents do masturbate, especially male adolescents, but then they're kind of pitted against this guilt, right? So they're kind of constantly like trying to fight the temptation of masturbation, but then, maybe every few weeks or every few months they fall prey to the temptation, kind of doing these quote quote unquote
Yeah.
things that, and then they, maybe go in and confess to their bishops, or they hide it and keep it secret. I've talked to many, many women who grew up feeling even worse than the men because they were like, they don't even talk to the girls about this. So I must be really weird if I'm doing something that really only boys should do, and so kind of that extra kind of shame component. But this is a pretty common experience for LDS adolescents, is this kind of war with your own sexual drive and your own sexual function. And you even in the show don't talk just about masturbation, but even lust, right? And several of the people in the show are saying, you should not lust after anybody. And lust, when you really break it down, is desire. It's desire, it's attraction, right? And so anytime you feel attraction towards another human being that has to do with a sexual eroticism, there's like a sense that you should feel badly about that. Yeah, so really, yeah, really interesting things. What do you feel like from a mental health perspective? I know you're not a mental health, person, but how do you think that that affected you growing up? Kind of those beliefs and, this idea that something that you could do, like touching your own body, would be second to murder.
Yeah. Well, certainly the shame aspect is there, but since I didn't do it, it might I might not have like I don't know if I'd use the word shame like some of my friends that I talk to now. Like they always had this shame because they did it, but they thought it was two steps below murder too. But I didn't have that. I didn't have that shame since I didn't do it. So mine was just more. I was certainly sent like I thought about it a lot, but I just never did it. And so how would that have affected me at that time? That's a good question. It's since it wasn't shame in that aspect. Um, I don't know. I guess it affected me enough to write a movie about it. It's certainly a big part of growing up and always having those thoughts, but not doing that. So maybe instead of shame, maybe more trying to control or maybe even enslave my own desires. I guess that could be in a mental aspect of how that influenced me then
Yeah,
and today.
right. It's
And
it's kind of, in a way, it's interfering with your sexual development, right? And it's even if you're not doing the thing, so there's not shame necessarily for the thing that you've done wrong. There's still kind of an internalized aspect that something that comes naturally to you should be stopped, right? And so,
yeah.
yeah, I think it is difficult to understand exactly how these things have affected us and how they affect us now when we're trying to be sexual, adults and share ourselves with other, another person or people that we're wanting to be sexually with.
Hmm.
So one of the critiques that we oftentimes hear from people who still remain in the church is that people who leave the church are angry ex-Mormons and they can't leave the church alone, right? So here you
Hmm.
are 20 plus years later after you've left making a movie about your experience, kind of, indirectly your experience as an LDS youth. So can you talk about, yeah, what was your maybe proclivity towards doing this particular theme? Why was this important to you? Why did this inspire you? Why 20 plus years are you still thinking about this enough that
Yeah.
yeah.
Well, so it's interesting when I left the Mormon church, like, uh, basically after that first, well, I guess probably 2 years after that, uh, I I just put it away. I didn't even think about it because I didn't listen to any, that wasn't aware of any ex-Mormon podcasts. I didn't have any ex-Mormon friends. So, so I just stopped thinking about Mormonism for probably 15 years. I didn't even think about it. It just wasn't a part of my life. And but yeah, it wasn't only till I guess it was probably about 4 years ago when I started thinking about some story ideas that that took place in Mormonism, that I started thinking about again, and then started listening to some of the ex-Mormon podcast and being part of the post-Mormon group. So I really didn't think about Mormonism for 15 years at all. And when I wrote this, I'm certainly angry. Some of the disturbing parts, I feel anger about, like that, the end of that Boyd Case Packer speech, but I wouldn't consider myself angry at the Mormon church or just angry in general. I think there's plenty of good qualities about it. And I think my parents and sister and still some loved ones are part of it. So, and so I'm actually quite careful, especially on Facebook, and about posting anything that's too publicly too critical of the church, because I don't want to. I have a great relationship with my parents, and so they know that I did this film, and they support me. They're happy that I did this film. They're not going to watch it. I don't want them to watch it, but I'm very careful about what I publicly say, like on Facebook and other places about the Mormon church. I can say it on some of these podcasts that I don't expect my loved ones to watch, but just like on general on Facebook, I'm careful about that.
Sure. Yeah. That's a difficult thing to navigate, right? When you have what you feel is a valid critique of a religious entity, but then you still, your people, your loved ones are part of that church community. It can feel difficult for them to not feel either offended or attacked because you're attacking kind of some of these ideas within the entity, right? So that's challenging for sure. All right, well, I'd like to kind of dive into some of the themes that I thought that I picked up on, and maybe you can tell me too, like what themes maybe I was missing that you were hoping to kind of get across. But one of the things that became pretty prevalent, and this all goes with all the people that I see as well as a mental health practitioner, that I think these are common themes, is that your sexuality kind of belongs to everybody else. So, and it kind of has this idea, the whole movie, most of the movie takes place in this kid's bedroom, right? And I don't want to share too much, I guess, about the movie, if spoiler alerts or whatever, but he gets kind of stuck in his bedroom because of this, which I think it's symbolic, right, of being stuck with this dilemma of being at war with yourself and whether or not you can touch your own body. So the whole room takes place with people coming in and out of his bedroom, beginning with his mother, and then you've got church community members who come in to try to help, and it's pretty prevalent that his sexuality belongs to the community. His mother in particular, right? She gets to navigate what he does or doesn't do with his body. And even at one point she says, "What have I done to deserve this?" Right. So his sexual relationship with himself and his own struggles with his own sexuality now is a personal affront to his own mother. I think that's very, very common. In fact, that's one of the things that we're working in therapy to deconstruct with so many people, is how do we get back to the point where our sexuality can belong to ourselves? So what are your thoughts about, was that one of the themes that you were trying to put forward?
Oh, totally. Yeah, that's perfect. Like he doesn't own it. And I should say a little bit kind of what happens in the beginning of the film for reviewers. The film is also, it's actually inspired by the Marky Peterson. There's also supposedly another anti-masturbation pamphlet by the Apostle Marky Peterson, and in the pamphlet he gives several suggestions on what you should do just to stop from masturbating or to not masturbate. And one of the things that he suggests is that if you're that tempted, you might need to tie your hand to the bedpost at night so you don't touch yourself. Yes. And so Ronald sees this pamphlet, and so he ends up handcuffing his hand to his bedpost. This is the night before he goes on his mission. And of course he wakes up and his mom sees him and she's very horrified, and they end up losing the key. And so the whole movie just takes place in the bedroom and he's locked in his handcuffs. So, and really, the main theme, I think, of the movie is is when you, kind of like what I was saying about myself, is when you suppress your true self, you enslave yourself, or you chain yourself, you become a slave. And so Ronald literally became a slave to his bed, chained up. So that to me is the main theme.
Yeah, no, thank you for bringing that up. And this Mark E. Peterson talk, which was another LDS leader, which you're absolutely correct, did give some of those suggestions. I just want to clarify that these were not things that were necessarily unique to the Mormon Church, right? So there were a lot of teachings around anti-masturbation at the turn of the century, you know, and early 1900s, late 1800s, but especially early 1900s, where you started having certain scientists talk about this leading to insanity, even things like acne, like a lot of weird things that even came from the scientific community that was just bad science. And so of course a lot of, you know, religious people got hold of that, and you had all of these ways that people could stop themselves from masturbating, one of them being actually physically restraining yourself, because you might in your sleep touch yourself without even really knowing that you're doing that unconsciously or whatever. And so it's really, really problematic how serious this was taken by so many people. Even, and you mentioned this in the show, you have cornflakes, right? So the
Yeah.
Kellogg came up with, he was a scientist, and as you're eating your morning cornflakes, you may not know that the original reason for both cornflakes and graham crackers was a mild food to temper the temptations of masturbation. That somehow that was a theory, that if you had mild, kind of boring type foods, that would help you masturbate less. So really interesting history we have here in the US around some of these things. But you're correct that our LDS leaders also, of course, took up some of these beliefs. And a few other things I just want to clarify for the audience. The reason why masturbation is seen as second to murder is and you can share what your thoughts are, Brent, but when I went and spoke with leaders about this when I was young, because I was like, that seems pretty harsh. It was all this idea about creation, your creative powers. And your movie talks about this at one point, right? That if you spread your seed, if you release your ejaculate, that is millions of potential babies that may not have been created, right? So, and any time that you mess with creative powers, if you murder somebody, you're taking somebody's life, if you are doing something sexual with another person, like premarital sex or masturbating, you're interfering with potential life coming into the world in the ways that it should. And so that's how those two are correlated. But you can imagine the mind dilemma for young people to think that what they're doing is as bad as murdering people. I mean, that's just a real kind of spiritually abusive thing to be teaching young people. So that's where that comes from. And also the sin of Onan. Do you want to talk about that? What the scripture is about that? That's often seen why masturbation is bad, but it's such an interesting take to the scriptures.
Yeah, it's a scripture in the Old Testament of where someone spills their own seed, and he was immediately struck to death. And so that's became a euphemism for masturbation, even though the scripture isn't necessarily about masturbation, but just, I guess, just wasting the seed. But somehow that became a euphemism for masturbation, as onanism.
Yeah, onanism was one of the names. Right, that's exactly right. He's not in trouble because he masturbated. He's in trouble because he doesn't want to impregnate this woman, where then those children might get some of his inheritance, right? So that was the true sin, quote unquote, that the story of Onan, if you want to consider that a sin, not wanting to impregnate somebody. But it wasn't, but that's how masturbation became such a problem. That's the only time masturbation is really mentioned in the Christian scriptures anyway. So super interesting. Okay, another theme that I thought was interesting, I'd like to kind of get your thoughts about why you included this. There's a scene where he has a sister, and she comes into his room, and she's in her underwear, and she's got her own cute little youthful body or whatever that's going on there, and you can tell that he's a bit aroused or finds her attractive. And she picks up on this and is very upset with her brother that he would have this reaction to her body. And we're having now a theme of incest, right, within the family system, which of course again is very common. And my thoughts, and then I'd like to hear your thoughts, is that when we repress sexuality so greatly, when we don't give especially adolescents outlets, appropriate outlets for their sexuality, dating, being out there with their peers and figuring out their sexuality, that sometimes that can get kind of manifested more within the family system, and you have more risk for sexual abuse and sexual issues happening within a family system. Do you want to speak to that at all? Was that at all?
Yeah, no, I totally agree with that. Yeah, especially that repression that I relate that to, like when the couple, like I was the perfect Mormon boy, but there's a couple of times like I looked at pornography and I would be like I would look at it like say maybe on a Tuesday and then I would feel so shameful, and then so I'm going to tell my bishop on Sunday, but for the next 5 days, since I'm never going to look at pornography again, that's all I'm going to do is look at pornography for the next 5 days and be obsessed with it, because I'm never going to look at it again in my life. And so I did that probably 2 or 3 times growing up. And it's really repression, like thinking it's so evil and then become obsessed. Like I guess you could even relate that to these crash diets where like I got to be perfect on Monday, so I'm going to be obsessed with food. And I think that's like you're withholding food or whatever it is. So that's the repression. And I think that's why there's so many Mormons that are, quote, addicted to pornography, because that shame, they feel so bad. They look at it and they feel I'll eventually tell my bishop about this and repent, but I'm going to be obsessed with this for the next several days until I tell my bishop about it. And so, yeah, that's what repression can do. And that scene with the sister, I wanted to make it, obviously it's just kind of it starts with a little bit funny that he can be attracted to her, but I wanted to make it where he's just not, it's not necessary. It's maybe our interpretation of him. Like, we don't know if he really is. He's looking at her, but the biggest takeaway from that is that the mom thinks like he didn't do anything. The mom assumes that he is, and then she tells her daughter, you need to cover up your shoulders because Ronald can't control himself. So it's without Ronald even, we don't even necessarily know that he was, turned on to his, it's really more the fact that his mom assumes that he is and wanted to control her daughter instead of trying to control him or trying to tell him that it was wrong.
Right. Instead of like, if she would have noticed something energetic like that, why not have a discussion with her son, right, about what's appropriate and inappropriate, and how to manage, arousal, instead of blaming the female, character for her body just being present, that's a problem, and how her body is presented, which is a huge modesty rhetoric that we get in the church as well, that women bear the responsibility for whether or not they're arousing another person, which is really not in their control. So you hit on kind of like all these very basic, themes, not basic, common, very common themes that are just riveting throughout even now in our culture now. I still hear tons of things about modesty rhetoric. The other thing that came across so much is just the lengths people will go to control their own or another person's sexuality, right? So, I mean, from Ronald himself, that kind of gets himself like, he's just duct taped himself and handcuffed himself. Like, that's a lot of lengths that people go to. And then all the lengths that all these people that are coming into his room are going to try to control this. We have, everything from blessings, laying on of hands, electroshock therapy, which was highly problematic. That was really interesting that you included that, because that was, and it's a BYU professor who is coming in and, doing this kind of electroshock conversion therapy, which was actually used for gay men in the 1970s at Brigham Young University and other universities as a way to try to convert people from their sexual orientation, which of course we know now is just horrendous and not anything that was going to be able to be done to begin with. So that was really interesting. And the theme with that as well, what I noticed is that here's this mother who's in and out of the movie the whole time, you know, her anxiety and her flustering, but she oftentimes will kind of put her authority aside and just allow, in particular, men to just be alone with her son, right? Like there's times when they're like, well, you have to leave. And she's like, oh, I guess I will. I'll just leave. And so this inherent trust of leaving her son alone with a male, older, more powerful figure in this situation, which is very indicative of what we do in the Mormon church with LDS worthiness interviews and confessions, where people go in and talk to a man. And for a long time, you know, adolescents and children were expected to do that kind of on their own. That has changed slightly due to a lot of complaints that people have said, but even to this day, that's a very typical practice. You can request to not be alone, but I think most people just have these interviews alone anyway. So can you speak to that intent of kind of that authority over the mother?
Yeah, and also, yeah, that's still, to me, this is that specific practice of, you know, these male authority, or there's these bishops talking to these these minors, yeah, about masturbation and their sexual thoughts or whatever. That to me is it should be such an easy fix that like they should just change a long time, but they could change that today. It's so easy, you know, just when it changed, they don't need to change their doctrine or anything. But that's just so unbelievable. They still talk to young kids, ask them about their masturbation habits, and that's so disturbing. Luckily, I had some really cool bishops growing up, and well, I didn't ever masturbate, so I never talked to them about it. But I did have, when I was on my mission, there was a general authority. He interviewed me, and he asked me. Actually, it's the only time anyone's actually point blank just asked me that. And he asked me if I have a problem masturbating. I said no, and he did not believe me. And he said, "Are you absolutely sure about that, Elder?" And I said, "Yeah." Like, and he just like shook his head, like he just did not believe me. And that actually really, that was supposed to be the highest person to God that I've ever talked to in my life. That was a general authority, and I thought very inspired by God, and to have him not believe me when I did not do that, like that was actually a pretty big tipping point in my life, thinking about that.
Right. That you would be, I mean, here you are doing your best. It sounds like you're pretty perfectionistic about a lot of these things and pretty scrupulous. And then he can't even honor that. He doubts you.
Yeah.
And yeah, where's his discernment, right?
Yeah.
Right. Yeah, for sure. There was a lot of communicated disgust about Ronald's situation, especially by the female people in the movie. And, you know, and you talk about it being kind of silly and kind of dark humor, but, you know, it's so interesting that wasn't my response. You know, as I watched it, to me, it was just heavy because I felt like, yeah, these are the messages that I'm working with in and out, you know, every day of my career. These are the internalized messages. And even though at points they were kind of they were being presented in kind of an extreme way, I actually know people where the extreme was there, you know, like I've had clients, you know, or people just talk to me about situations like, you know, being kind of locked in their rooms throughout the week until they would have to confess to the bishop every Sunday, and their families would kind of like, you know, either lock them away kind of in basements or in rooms so that they would be able to control their sexuality. There's stories like that exist. And, you know, there's people who take this so seriously, like to what lengths will people go to, where I've talked with many men in particular that were wishing or tried to cut off their genitalia because that would be a way to control this, you know, drive that is being communicated in such extreme ways. You have a clip in the movie of Boyd K. Packer, and he's talking about, you can hear the languaging, right? Like, you're in Satan's grasp, this is evil, this is pernicious, this is perverse. I mean, the leaders of the LDS Church have a history of using very, what I call, provocative language that really incites this fear and this shame about something that's just so natural kind of within you. So people go to huge lengths to control either themselves or others. And you can see the despair in the mother, right? Like, why is she so despaired? Is because, what does this mean? This means that maybe my son won't be able to go on his mission. It maybe means that he can't be saved with us as a family eternally, right? And be with us in the hereafter. So these are high costs that, yes, you're trying to bring some humor and silliness to, but for me, it's like, yeah, this is heavy for a good reason.
Yeah, then that's actually, I get that quite a bit, and that's actually one of my favorite compliments. I usually have several people come to the screening, after the screening, come up to me and say, like, they saw the trailer and they were expecting kind of a silly movie about, masturbation, kind of a more Saturday Night Live SNL tape on it. And I specifically, I didn't want to make like an SNL skit, just a silly skit. I wanted there to certainly be a lot of silly moments, but have a lot of heavy, meaningful scenes in it. And so that's actually some of my favorite compliments, when people say they were expecting it to be a silly take on masturbation, but it ends up being just a more powerful take on the themes, or on Mormonism. And it really, I wanted to originally, I just had I started thinking about all the problems that I have with Mormonism, from racism to obviously the whole sexuality repression. And so I had a list of 7 or 8 things, and I tried to hit on most of those in the film. So yeah, so I wanted to make not just a silly movie, but just to go through those have a meaningful discussion.
Right. Yeah, can you talk a little bit about the race part? I mean, that's an interesting kind of side note that you kind of threw in there. Tell me what you were thinking about that.
Yeah, so in the film, we have someone come in there, and he ends up taking off his shirt, and he reads the passage in the Book of Mormon, the original passage in the Book of Mormon, talking about how Lamanites, if they were to become righteous, then they'll become pure and white. White and delightsome. And so that they changed it to pure and delightsome in 1981. So anyways, he does that, and he believes that he joined the church a couple of years ago, and he believes that his skin is actually becoming white and delightsome. And so that's just a very disturbing aspect of the church. And I've actually talked to people that literally, including actually a former companion, who's Native American, and he knows that story very well, and he actually hosted the last event at Brewvies, and I was very curious what he would think about that scene. And so he actually, at the end, I didn't know what he'd think of that. And so anyways, he ended up crying during the movie. He said, and he just gave me a hug, and he said he loved it, and he said finally feels like someone brought that aspect and just other aspects of the film to life. And he thought that was just very powerful in his mind. And so I just wanted to just touch upon a lot of the disturbing aspects of Mormonism, and that is one of the worst ones.
Yeah, that was obviously uncomfortable to watch for sure, and speaks to so much of what we have in our history that we've not really addressed appropriately at all yet, as a church. I mean, there's been some interesting conversations and acknowledgments about racism in the church. There's never been an actual apology, and the scriptures remain, right? The scriptures remain canonized that have to do with this idea that the color of your skin is going to be somewhat affected by the level of your righteousness. You even have the people kind of referring to him as a Lamanite, which I don't think we see as much these days amongst LDS culture, but I think in the 80s and 90s, we definitely did have that, where that's kind of how people were referred to, people of color. So yeah, really, really problematic, uncomfortable, and yet very much a part of our recent and current history that we're not necessarily addressing full on. So
Yeah, that scene is super. It's hard to take, and also the electroshock therapy. It also, and I knew it, like, it walked that line of, I wanted to be not trying to like do a lighthearted version of it. And that originally, so in the electroshock therapy one, so in the film he shows a picture of a man in a Speedo, and when I was writing, I was thinking about, is it too much of a lighthearted take on? And would it be too triggering? I was thinking to some people, and then I actually was talking with my brother about it. We thought, like, maybe it might be too triggering. Maybe I should make that picture like a woman. And then I started thinking that'd be less triggering. But then I started thinking, you know what? That sanitizes the church. They didn't do this to straight people. And so that totally sanitizes that part. So I kept that part in, even though it's tough. But that brings up discussion. Like, a lot of people don't even know about that they performed electroshock therapy. So that brings up that discussion.
Well, and the interesting dilemma that, here at a church university, they were actually showing pornographic images of gay individuals, having gay sex, and they were actually showing those images to elicit arousal and then try to shock that arousal out of them, right? So for folks that might be like, why would they, aren't we not supposed to look at porn, right? But here they are actually, on purpose showing porn so that these types of kind of reactions can be mitigated. It was just, it's just so hard to kind of make sense of all of that, and how damaging that was. I mean, I've had several people in my practice and also kind of just talk to me personally about those experiences because they grew up in those times, went to BYU during those times. It's just extremely damaging, something that lasts with them, like any, kind of big trauma like that can last really the rest of their life.
Yeah.
So there was another theme that I thought was interesting, is that this idea that, well, if you just do the things that you're supposed to do, of course the problem will stop, right? And so you have this really interesting kind of imagery of his hand handcuffed by a metal, a metal component. And people are like, okay, I release you, I heal you, just get dressed, let's go. Like kind of this idea that just, we did the things, we did the correct, righteous things. So why aren't you just being released from this handcuff? And they're even trying, they're almost like ripping his hand apart. It's like, how could you explain that our spiritual measures isn't going to help this very physical aspect? And I thought that was a really interesting contraindication, right? That I think so many people wrestle with. I see this with depression. Well, if you just pray, you won't be depressed. If you do this or that, you won't be, a sex addict. If you do this, if you just pray and read your scriptures, you won't lose your faith. It's like these very simplistic ideas that you can solve this problem of a handcuff through just prayer, spiritual means. So do you want to speak on that message? Because that came across loud.
Sure. Yeah. Thoughts and prayers that will solve everything. That is a powerful thing that you brought up, and especially Ronald he was the perfect Mormon. He didn't do it, and he was praying, and he did everything that he was supposed to. He followed the apostles' advice. He chained himself to a bed, and look at him where he was. He was slave to his bed. But that also led, and also that there's so many like this, some of the themes and some of the disturbing scenes, I still think I hoping that viewers will leave the theater feeling liberated. And I think that's what, like, Ronald is that perfect Mormon boy, and he gets, I'll have these horrible things happen to him, even though he was perfect, the perfect Mormon boy, but he has these horrible things happen. But I think he comes to a conclusion at the end where he feels, he liberates himself in a way. And so I'm hoping that that's the ultimate theme of the movie too, is liberation. I'm hoping that people leave there feeling liberated, not just sad or angry or whatever, thinking about the church, but also just feeling liberation. Especially in post-Mormons, it's super fun watching that with 100 other post-Mormons, and I think it's really communal experience watching it with other people that have gone through similar experiences.
Right. Yeah, right. Well, and it goes back to my anecdotal experience with folks is that the more perfectionistic or scrupulous they were, either to your point, they were able to abstain from kind of a natural drive, or when they didn't, they would go in and confess incessantly, right? Whereas I think the more general population that maybe wasn't as scrupulous or perfectionistic kind of learned from these kinds of, just observing how people were treated. I probably should protect myself by not confessing or not being honest about this particular part of my life. And so they just never did talk to their bishops about it, or which is why there's also, of course, this great distrust, right? That of course you must be lying if you're telling me you've never masturbated, right? There's like a phrase going about, it's not like when you masturbate, or it's not if you've masturbated, it's when you've masturbated last, right? That these ecclesiastical leaders should be asking that question, because we're just going to assume everybody is. So although the majority of people do, I mean, the numbers are up to 80 and 90%, there's obviously that 10 to 20% that are not, and that are maybe not due to these religious beliefs. And to your point, that feels very, just kind of disenfranchising, right? To have somebody just assume you're lying. And so for me, it just goes to show how from a pretty early age, we're taught to fear the consequence of talking about our sexuality. And therefore we go internal and we don't share, and we don't, admit to things, which then can lead to a lot of problems with a relationship with secrecy later on when you're in relationships and things like that, because the cost is too high. If I'm really honest about who I am sexually, I'm going to be punished, or ridiculed or shamed, or, have to talk to the Relief Society president or whatever. There's also, I would just say, a lot of correlation and causation problems with masturbation, and even pornography in the show is brought up as being blamed for everything. Like, there's this one scene where I think it's like, this man who got divorced and then did these horrible things, and he murdered his family, I think, even, and it all comes back to, well, because he was looking at porn, and that just took him down the slippery slope of debauchery and horrificness until he became, this horrible person. So you have a lot of that throughout the film as well, just that let's blame everything bad on a person's sexuality.
Yeah. Do you remember, like, in the 80s, remember the serial killer Ted Bundy? He was killed he was executed in death penalty in about mid 80s, 85, 86. And I remember the interview before his execution, he blamed pornography on him murdering people. And I've heard that so many times in the world of Mormonism, that about that specific Ted Bundy interview, is that he blames it on pornography.
Yeah.
And so, that was interesting. I haven't heard that in a while, but I remember that was pretty prevalent in the 90s.
Yeah, and it still prevails as one of the most common myths about sexual media, is that if you watch it, you're going to become more violent or more objectifying of women, or more even, it's even to the point that you'll become a pedophile. I mean, just ridiculous claims that are not substantiated by research at all. we are living in the biggest porn experiment of the world, whether you are okay, happy about that or upset about that. That's just kind of the reality of what we're living in. And, we don't see an increase in murders and, rages just because people have exponentially increased their ability to watch, sexual media, sexually explicit messages. So it's a very interesting scapegoat, and it's very easily scapegoated. And the thing that makes me especially angry with people who have committed crimes is that it becomes an excuse, and like almost like a justifying, like, well, it's porn's fault, it's not really my fault. And I'm like, yeah, that's not going to fly by me. And it's upsetting when that's used as a legal recourse to basically lower people's accountability, like sentencing and things like that. So it's very, very upsetting to me that it's used in that way. All right, probably the last thing I'll ask you about, because it definitely touched me, just even kind of from my own personal experience, was the final meeting that he finally has with his father, right? So all along, his mother's kind of threatening, right? Like, well, I'm going to call dad because, what are all the things I'm trying to figure out this problem with, as your mom is not working, so we're going to call dad. And you can see that the kid is kind of begging and pleading for father not to be called. And then father finally comes in, and he doesn't necessarily say anything more horrific or look at him with more disgust than everybody else did. I think everybody shared pretty horrific things with this kid, but the kid's reaction to his father is very different. He really, as soon as his father leaves, he really breaks down and kind of like sobbing and fear. And for somebody, I was not physically necessarily abused, but I think that I definitely had a parent figure who was so kind of scary or intimidating that just a stern talking to could leave me in that same state. So I just wondered what was going on there for you as far as why you included that.
Yeah, to me, that the father scene, that's probably the most disturbing, and that's kind of where I wanted to have it. That's the really just based on the Boyd K. Packer, like the whole gut punch. In fact, he even kind of brings up a story that Boyd K. Packer talked about. And really the most disturbing part too is when at the end the father says, if I see you in under 2 years, it better be in a body bag. And that's something that we've all heard similar phrases of that about going on a mission. It'd be better to die than to come home unworthy,
Dishonorably.
and dishonorably. And that's the moment he breaks down. And this is probably the hardest, at least for me, to watch.
Yeah. And just goes to show how powerful, how impactful we can be, as parents and as leaders and mentors to young developing brains and identities, right? And how many of us are in therapy years later undoing a lot of that stuff that was done to us when we were in those ages. And it's very common to hear that don't come back. It'd be better for you to be dead than to come back dishonorably. That's something I've heard many, many people tell me that was actually said to them by a parent, in particular, a parent. So that's highly disturbing. Doesn't really give much ability, obviously, for any mistakes, but also even for any distressing feelings, like if you're anxious or depressed on your mission and you're really struggling. I know a lot of people struggle with suicidal ideas, and it's like, well, I can't reach out and get help because I've been told not to. There's no recourse here for coming home early, right?
Mm-hmm.
We're doing better, I think, as a church in regards to those kinds of issues, but things still have a long way to go.
Yeah, well, I think because now it's so common. There's so many missionaries that come home early now. When I was in the late 90s, I didn't know anyone there's no one on my mission, but now I hear that it's a huge. So right. I think people are used to that now.
Yeah. Well, they're having to have a more mental health informed way of going about these, journeys that a lot of people are really unprepared for from a health perspective. So, all right. What, if anything, did I miss? Was there anything that you felt like, okay, she didn't talk about this or didn't ask me about that? Was there anything that?
No, it It was great. Yeah, I'm super excited to have you hosts on August 3rd, Thursday at Brewvies, Salt Lake City. And so that will be my I did, let's see, I've done 3 Utah screenings. I did two in Salt Lake, one in St. George, did one in San Diego, my hometown. So this be my 4th screening of the film. They've all turned out great, and it's been super fun. And I've had a different member of the post-Mormon community host each event. So it's super fun.
Yeah, no, that sounds great. And tell us what has happened. Like, tell us a little bit about the film kind of side of this. So, have you taken this film places? Has it been acknowledged by anybody? Like, what's your trajectory as a filmmaker in getting this film dispersed?
I showed it at one film festival in California, Ida Wild, and was nominated for a few awards. And it was actually just the San Diego Film Awards. We just had their film award ceremony just about 2 weeks ago, and it was nominated for best film, best feature film, best writing, and 2 actor awards, and it ended up winning the best screenplay. So that was fun to win that in my hometown.
Yeah, that's amazing. Congratulations.
Oh, thank you.
Absolutely.
And so, yeah, my plan now is to probably start getting the Blu-rays ready, sell those for a couple months, maybe to do 1 or 2 other screenings, and then have it be online probably this fall.
Okay. All right. Wonderful. Well, come check us out on August 3rd if you can. Look for Ronald's Little Factory as something to put on your to-view list. It was lovely talking to you, Brent. Thank you so much for spending this time with me.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me.
All right.
Can't wait for next week.
All right.
All right.
Take care.
Yeah.
Bye-bye.
You too. Bye.
Thank you for listening to this episode of the Natasha Helfer Podcast. To help keep this podcast going, please consider donating at natashahelfer.com and share this episode. To watch the video of this podcast, you can subscribe to Natasha's channel on YouTube and follow her professional Facebook page at Natasha Helfer, LCMFT, CST-S. You can find all her cool resources at natashahelfer.com. The intro and outro music for these episodes are by Otter Creek.
There is a place where time slows to nature's pace, and there is space there to find yourself in her embrace. Some places should be left alone. So we can always go to the homeland of the heart. 10,000 years of our human history etched on her canyon walls, alongside Earth's mysteries. Some places should be left alone. So we can always go to the homeland of the heart, to the homeland of the heart. Deep in our cities, we sleep without her stars, yet still her presence sustains us from afar. Some places should be left alone. to the homeland of the heart, to the homeland of the heart, to the homeland